In a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, life moved at an ordinary, predictable rhythm. Morning joggers waved at neighbors they barely knew. Lawn sprinklers clicked on and off like clockwork. And every house seemed to follow an unspoken rule: don't stand out too much. But on the corner lot of Brookhaven Drive, one property refused to blend in. It belonged to Earl Maddox, a Vietnam War veteran in his late 60s who kept mostly to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, just private. The kind of man who preferred fixing things with his hands rather than talking about the past. Neighbors knew him as the quiet one with the oak tree. That tree was impossible to ignore. Towering, wide, and deeply rooted, it stood like a living monument in the front yard. Its branches stretched over the fence line as if protecting not just the property but the entire memory of the land itself. In summer, it cast a massive shade across Earl's porch. In autumn, it turned the street into a golden corridor of falling leaves. But for Earl, it wasn't decoration. It was memory. 40 years earlier, shortly after returning from Vietnam, Earl had planted that oak with his own hands. The soil had been rough, the roots fragile, and his own life even more unstable. He had lost friends in the war, and he came home carrying silence heavier than any luggage. Planting the tree had been his way of staying grounded. "If it survives," he once told a neighbor years ago, "so will I." And somehow both had. Over the decades, the tree grew with him. It survived storms that ripped roofs off nearby houses. It survived summers so hot the asphalt softened. It survived winters that froze the neighborhood still. And through it all, Earl never once considered cutting it down, not even when its roots began lifting parts of the sidewalk. To him, it wasn't just wood and leaves. It was time itself, standing still in one place. But peace in Brookhaven Drive never lasted long. One crisp morning, things began to change. White survey stakes appeared along the edge of the neighboring property. Then came orange markings sprayed onto the grass. Then heavy trucks rolled in, rumbling louder than anything the neighborhood was used to. Earl noticed immediately. He stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching men in reflective vests walk the lot next door. They carried clipboards, laser tools, and walked with the confidence of people who believed everything around them belonged to a spreadsheet. At first, Earl assumed it was routine construction. But then he saw where they were measuring. Too close. Uncomfortably close. By midday, metal equipment had been positioned near the property line. A section of fencing was removed without warning, and one of the workers, without even looking up, drove a stake directly into the ground beneath the edge of Earl's oak tree's shadow. That was the moment Earl's calm shifted. He walked down his driveway slowly, boots heavy against the gravel. The conversation that followed was short, tense, and already misaligned. The site supervisor smiled too easily, explaining it was just preliminary clearing and nothing to worry about. But Earl's eyes never left the tree, because he knew exactly where the property line was. And this wasn't it. He told them to stop. Once firmly. But machines don't stop for warnings when they've already been scheduled to move. By late afternoon, the first chainsaw started. The sound cut through the neighborhood like a warning siren no one understood yet. Birds scattered from the branches. Leaves trembled before falling in sudden bursts. And for the first time in 40 years, the oak tree that had stood untouched began to suffer damage. Earl didn't shout. He didn't run. He just stood there watching as a limb, the same one where he used to hang a small wooden swing decades ago, splintered and fell. A neighbor across the street began filming. Someone else called out in confusion. But Earl said nothing. Not yet. He only stepped forwards, picked up a broken branch from the ground, and held it for a moment like it weighed more than wood. Then, in a voice barely above the machine noise, he spoke one sentence. "They didn't just cut a tree." He paused, eyes locked on the destruction continuing in front of him. "They just started something they don't understand." And as the chainsaws roared again, the oak tree, 40 years of memory, silence, and survival, began to fall piece by piece. Cliffhanger, Earl slowly turns away from the scene and reaches for a phone he hasn't used in years. the night after the tree was cut felt different in Brookhaven Drive. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. In fact, it was almost too quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, unsure of what had just happened or what might come next. Earl Maddox sat alone in his living room, the curtains slightly open. The porch light outside cast a dull glow across his yard, illuminating what remained of the oak tree. Stumps, splinters, broken limbs scattered like discarded memories. He didn't turn on the television, he didn't answer the few concerned knocks from neighbors earlier in the evening. He simply sat in a worn chair, staring out at the damage. For most people, it would have looked like just a tree being removed. For Earl, it looked like 40 years of silence being erased in a single afternoon. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to tension. Whispers moved faster than cars on the street. People stood in driveways talking longer than usual. Phones were held a little tighter. Everyone had seen what happened, but no one fully understood how it had been allowed. By mid-morning, the developer's representatives returned to the site as if nothing unusual had occurred. A polished white truck pulled up and out stepped the site manager, a man in his 40s wearing a clean polo shirt and a practiced smile. He spoke loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Just routine clearing," he said casually to a small group of concerned neighbors. "We're improving the area, nothing to worry about." But Earl was already outside. He stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, watching every movement. The explanation didn't match what he had seen the day before. The markers, the angles, the cut lines, they all crossed into his property, not by inches, by intention. He walked toward them slowly. The site manager noticed him and offered a polite nod, like nothing had happened. "Morning, sir, we're just wrapping up some preliminary work." "That tree was on my property," Earl said calmly. The manager smiled, as if he had heard this before. "We've reviewed the survey data. Everything is within approved limits." Earl didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted past the man, toward the flattened remains of the oak. 40 years. A life measured in rings of growth, now reduced to debris. "You're wrong," Earl said quietly. A pause followed, the kind of pause that makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't belong to either side. The manager adjusted his clipboard. "Sir, if there's an issue, you can contact the office, but this project is fully permitted. We can't delay construction for—" "For what?" Earl interrupted, finally looking him in the eye. "For accuracy." The silence that followed was heavier than the machinery. A few neighbors had gathered now, standing near their porches. One woman whispered that she had seen the markings go beyond the fence line. Another mentioned she had warned the workers the day before, but was ignored. Still, the developer's team remained confident. Too confident. By noon, chainsaws started again, but this time it wasn't the oak tree. It was cleanup. Debris removal, final clearing, normalization of what had already been done. Earl watched every movement without speaking, but something had changed in the way he stood. The stillness in him was no longer passive, it was controlled, measured, intentional. One of the workers accidentally kicked a broken branch toward the curb. It rolled and stopped near Earl's feet. He picked it up again. Same piece as before. He turned it slowly in his hand, studying the rough edge where it had been severed. A neighbor approached cautiously from behind. "Mr. Maddox, are you okay?" Earl didn't look away from the branch. "I've been through worse than this," he said quietly, "but not often for something so careless." The neighbor hesitated. "What are you going to do?" For the first time that morning, Earl's expression changed, not anger, not sadness, but something colder. Not what they expect. Across the street, the site manager was already on his phone, laughing lightly as he spoke to someone higher up the chain. "Yeah, it's handled," he said. "Just a stubborn homeowner situation, nothing serious." He had no idea Earl was watching him. And even less idea that Earl wasn't alone anymore. That evening, Earl made a single call from an old phone he rarely used. The voice on the other end answered instantly. Earl, it's been a long time. Earl looked out at the empty space where the oak once stood. Yeah, he said, it has. He paused. I need you to check something for me. Cliffhanger, on the other end of the call, the voice goes silent after hearing one detail, then says, Earl, that land shouldn't have been touched at all. The moment those words were spoken on the phone, the silence on the other end stretched longer than Earl Maddox liked. That land shouldn't have been touched at all. Earl stood in the dim light of his kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, the other gripping the old receiver. Outside, the remains of the oak tree still sat in the yard like a wound that hadn't closed. Explain, Earl said simply. A deep breath came through the line. The voice belonged to someone who clearly had spent years in technical offices and government meetings, not casual conversations. Earl, that parcel of land, the boundary markers, the original survey lines, they were never meant to be altered. That tree you're talking about, it was planted exactly on a protected reference point. Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not in any public record I've seen. It wouldn't be, the voice replied. Not fully. Some of it was tied to older federal land agreements, military-era boundary documentation, the kind that doesn't get updated unless a full resurvey is authorized. Earl didn't respond immediately. 40 years ago, when he planted that tree, he hadn't done it randomly. He remembered choosing that exact spot because an old survey stake had been half buried there already. At the time, he didn't think much of it, just a forgotten marker on forgotten ground. Now that memory felt different. Who authorized the construction? Earl asked. Another pause. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The line went quiet for a moment, filled only with faint static. Then the voice continued, lower this time. If they removed that tree without a certified boundary confirmation, they didn't just damage property. They may have violated protected land code tied to veteran memorial preservation statutes. Earl slowly set the receiver down for a moment, rubbing his forehead, not from stress, but from recognition. Pieces were starting to align in a way that made everything look less like an accident and more like negligence built on assumption. Or worse, carelessness disguised as authority. Across town, at the developer's site office, confidence still ruled the room. The site manager stood in front of a digital layout screen, pointing at clean lines and profit projections. The mood was light, easy, controlled. Once cleanup is done, we move phase 2 forward, he said. We're only dealing with one homeowner, he'll settle down. A few chuckles followed. Someone mentioned legal paperwork would sort itself out. But behind the polished confidence, a junior assistant hesitated. Sir, there's been a request for a federal land review flag on the project. The room went quiet for half a second. The manager frowned. What kind of flag? Boundary verification hold, the assistant said carefully. It came through this morning, no explanation yet, just immediate pause pending inspection. The manager waved it off. That's standard delay nonsense, probably a clerical issue. But even as he said it, he glanced at the screen again. Something about the timing felt off. Back at Earl's house, the second call came in quickly after the first ended. Same voice. And this time, urgency had replaced hesitation. Earl, I pulled the archived survey overlays. That tree you planted, it wasn't just near the marker. It was the marker, or what's left of it. Earl closed his eyes briefly. So they cut it. Yes, the voice said, and if they did that without confirmation, every permit tied to that land allocation is now questionable. A bit. Then the voice added something heavier. Earl, this doesn't just affect your property. That made him open his eyes again. What are you saying? I'm saying if this gets formally flagged, any development tied to that contractor's survey chain could be frozen, not just your neighborhood, multiple sites. Earl looked out the window again. The empty space where the oak once stood now felt less like loss, and more like a trigger point no one had understood they were touching. And you think they'll care about that? Earl asked quietly. The voice didn't answer immediately. Then, No, but the system will. That night Earl didn't sleep. Instead, he wrote down every detail he remembered: dates, names, the exact positioning of the tree, the first time the stakes appeared, the moment the chainsaws started. Every detail became part of something larger than memory. It became documentation. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, an automated system processed the federal flag request. And without human approval, it escalated. Cliffhanger: early morning alerts begin appearing across multiple construction sites linked to the same developer, each one marked with the same word: hold. By sunrise, Brookhaven Drive no longer felt like an ordinary suburban street. It felt watched. Earl Maddox noticed it first, not through people but through absence. The construction noise that had dominated the previous days was gone. No engines, no saws, no trucks revering with their constant warning beeps. Just stillness. Too much stillness. From his porch, Earl could see the empty lot where the oak tree once stood, now flattened into a scar of dirt and sawdust. But beyond that, something else had changed. The developer's crew wasn't there. Instead, two unmarked vehicles were parked near the entrance gate. Men in plain jackets stood nearby, not working, not supervising, observing. Earl didn't move immediately. He had seen enough in life to recognize when a situation stopped being local and started becoming institutional. Across the street, neighbors began gathering again, this time with more uncertainty than outrage. Phones were out, but not filming for entertainment anymore, recording as evidence. Whispered conversations replaced yesterday's anger. Something had shifted overnight. At the construction site office, panic was starting to surface beneath forced calm. The site manager stood in front of a tablet, refreshing the project status repeatedly. Each time, the same word remained unchanged. Hold. No explanation, no timeline, no override option. He tried calling headquarters. No answer. He tried internal support channels. Same result. Then a second message arrived, stamped with higher authority clearance than anything he had ever seen associated with the project. Temporary suspension of all ground activity pending federal boundary verification review. The manager stared at it, jaw tightening. This has to be a mistake, he muttered. But deep down he already knew it was. Outside, one of the plain-clothed officials walked the perimeter slowly, marking points on a digital device. Another photographed the ground where the oak tree had been removed. Every angle, every marker, every disturbed patch of soil. Earl watched from a distance unnoticed, until one of the officials finally looked up. Their eyes met briefly. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just understanding. Inside the neighborhood, rumors began spreading faster than facts. Some said it was a zoning issue, others claimed insurance problems, a few thought it was a contractor dispute gone wrong. But the oldest neighbor on the street, who had lived there longer than most houses, spoke quietly to anyone who would listen. That tree, she said, shaking her head, wasn't just a tree, it marked something old, something they shouldn't have touched. By midday, local news vans began arriving. The story had leaked. Construction halted in Brookhaven Drive pending federal review, one reporter announced, standing near the entrance gate. But what they didn't yet understand was that Brookhaven Drive was only the surface. Because as the federal hold expanded through automated systems, something unexpected began happening behind the scenes. Other project files, ones linked to the same developer group, started flashing red. Not just one site. Not two. Dozens. In multiple counties. The same status appeared everywhere. Hold boundary verification required. Back at headquarters, executives who had ignored early warnings were now in emergency meetings. Screens filled with maps, project timelines, and suddenly frozen assets. This is isolated, one executive insisted. But no one fully believed it anymore. Because isolated problems don't replicate across an entire network overnight. Meanwhile, Earl received another call. Same voice. But now it carried something different, urgency mixed with disbelief. "Earl, this isn't just your property anymore." Earl didn't respond immediately. He already suspected that. "How bad is it?" he asked. There was a pause. Then the voice answered honestly. "If this audit continues, every permit tied to their survey system could be invalidated. That includes active builds across multiple states." Earl looked out at the empty space again. Where a tree once stood. A tree no one had thought twice about cutting. Except him. And whoever had just realized too late what it represented. In the distance, the first tow trucks arrived at the construction site, not to resume work, but to remove equipment. Silently. Systematically. One by one. The developer's site manager stood frozen as workers began packing up machinery. "This is temporary," he shouted. "Someone fix this." But no one answered him anymore. Because decisions were no longer being made at his level. Cliffhanger at headquarters, a senior executive receives a single notification on their screen. Nationwide compliance review initiated. Notification didn't arrive with fanfare. No alarms, no flashing sirens, just a single line that appeared on every executive screen inside the developer's headquarters. Nationwide compliance review initiated. For a moment, nobody spoke. The conference room, usually loud with confident projections and aggressive expansion plans, went completely silent. Pens stopped moving, chairs stopped shifting, even the air seemed heavier, like the building itself had understood something had changed. Then the questions started. "What does nationwide mean in this context?" one executive asked. "It means," another said slowly, reading again, "every active project tied to their survey and permitting chain is now under review." That should have been impossible. But the screen didn't care what should or shouldn't happen. It only displayed what was already happening. Across multiple states, construction sites that had been running smoothly just 48 hours earlier were now frozen. Equipment stood idle behind caution tape. Workers were sent home mid-shift. Payment systems flagged delays. Insurance partners paused coverage reviews. And every single file carried the same status. Holds boundary and permit validation required. Back in Brookhaven Drive, Earl Maddox sat on his porch as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. The empty lot where his oak tree once stood now had 2 uniformed inspectors walking its perimeter again, marking measurements with quiet precision. The neighborhood, once curious, was now fully alert. Curtains were drawn back. Phones were permanently in hand. Even the site manager, who only days earlier had spoken with confidence and dismissal, was no longer present. His truck was gone, his voice absent, his authority reduced to silence. Earl didn't look satisfied. He didn't look surprised either. He simply looked like a man waiting for something he already knew was coming. By mid-afternoon, the developer's internal emergency meeting escalated into something closer to damage control panic. "We need to isolate Brookhaven Drive as an anomaly," one executive insisted. "If we contain this narrative, the rest of the portfolio stabilizes." But another voice cut in sharply. "It's not isolated anymore. The audit expanded this morning. Every project using their survey validation system is being rechecked." A long pause followed. Then the worst realization settled in. The problem wasn't the neighborhood. It was the foundation the entire expansion system was built on. Meanwhile, news coverage finally broke beyond local reports. Multi-state construction halt linked to federal boundary verification review flashed across early headlines. Reporters scrambled to find a cause. Developers refused detailed statements. Government offices issued vague confirmations of ongoing compliance processes. But none of them mentioned the tree. Not yet. Back in Brookhaven Drive, one of the inspectors approached Earl directly for the first time. He was younger than expected, carrying a tablet and a folder of printed maps. "Mr. Maddox," he asked cautiously. Earl nodded. The inspector hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "We've confirmed the marker alignment," he said. "The original reference point you mentioned, it was never officially decommissioned. That tree, it was planted directly on it." Earl didn't react outwardly, but something in his eyes tightened slightly. The inspector continued. "When it was removed, it triggered inconsistencies across the entire survey chain tied to that contractor's filings. That's why everything escalated." A pause. Then more quietly, "You may have just exposed a system-wide error." Earl looked past him toward the empty ground. "I didn't expose anything," he said calmly. "I just told the truth about one tree." The inspector nodded slowly, as if realizing the weight of that statement. Because it wasn't just about a tree. It was about what happens when assumptions replace verification. At headquarters, the situation collapsed further. A senior compliance officer entered the room holding printed reports that no one wanted to see. "We've traced it," he said flatly. All eyes turned to him. "It's not just a paperwork error, it's a cascading validation failure. Their entire survey chain is compromised." Silence again. Then someone whispered, "How far does it go?" The officer didn't hesitate. "Every active development linked to their system, potentially dozens of sites, possibly more as the audit expands." A chair scraped back. Someone cursed under their breath. And for the first time since the project began, no one in the room had a solution. Only consequences. Back in Brookhaven Drive, Earl stood up for the first time that day and walked slowly to the edge of his yard. The inspector stepped aside respectfully. He looked at the ground where the oak had once stood. Not as a battlefield. Not as a victory. But as something that had been part of his life for longer than most people had known his name. Behind him, one of the inspectors spoke quietly. "They've ordered full suspension until further notice." Earl nodded once, then said something that made the inspector stop writing. "Good," Earl said, "then maybe now someone will actually look before they build." A long silence followed. Far away, across multiple states, construction sites stood frozen under legal review. And for the first time, the developer wasn't expanding. They were stopping. Cliffhanger at headquarters, the final message arrives. All operations suspended pending federal audit completion, effective immediately.